Okay. Hey everyone, I'm Zoe.
I'm Jillian.
We both debated for Scarsdale in New York for 4 years. So today we're teaching about leveraging frameworks against decay. So philosophically, usually, and today we're going to do analytic frameworks. And we're going to talk about how we leverage things like Kant or virtue ethics or Hegel against critiques. And also talk about like how to do like ideal theory good arguments. Because there are a lot of abstraction, good, bad debates that happen now. And we want to talk to you guys about how to win those debates.
I guess the first thing is what sort of moves generally make it difficult to apply these frameworks to critiques? Why is it not a universal practice?
Maybe we should back up for 1 second. Do you guys all know, have you guys all been like familiar with or have had debates where it's been framework versus K? Raise your hand if you have. Okay. Raise your hand if you've like seen, like at least seen one of these debates play out. Or have you heard about people leveraging frameworks against the K or reading Ks against specific frameworks? Okay. Cool.
Okay. So, what sort of framing mechanism do critiques generally utilize? Mm-hmm.
So let's roll the ballot, just quickly. Fun. This is a small group, so we have to have like, you guys don't have to raise your hands. You just have to like, we have to have a lot of participation here. Yeah, so it's like why the judge should vote on the critique. I think the framework of the critique.
What is distinct about a roll of the ballot from any regular ethical framework?
A regular framework might tell you how the roll of life should be. The roll of the ballot tells you what the ballot means specifically.
So, the role of the ballot is a framework argument specific to what debate should be, and it is about usually what educational spaces talk about. This is like what we would, an example of like a pre-fiat argument.
Yeah. Everyone knows what pre-fiat means? Yeah, cool. Pre-fiat's like about the debate space, basically. Like the physical debate space, sort of, rather than like the hypothetical arguments you're making. So roles of that are usually justified with like, there's not always a role of the judge that's sort of like justified in the round, but sometimes, but usually if it is, it's as an educator. And usually even if there's not an explicit role of the judge, role of ballot debates play out so that people weigh between roles of the ballot under education.
Mm-hmm. So, why does this make it more difficult to leverage the framework arguments against the critique? Yeah.
Because most of the framework implications play out like outside of the round. So we've got sort of like this distinction between like the pre-fiat and the post-fiat. The role of the ballot says before we even look at the framework implications, we have to look at what we're doing inside this round.
Yeah, definitely. People try to leverage the pre-post-fiat distinction. It's sort of weird though because it's like hard to really draw a hard line about where pre-fiat begins and post-fiat ends, right? It can be difficult to know, like, why, when you read a Kant framework, are you saying that only agents in your hypothetical world, right? Like your hypothetical policy scenario, for example. Why are only those agents supposed to be treated as means? Treated as ends in themselves, or things like that. Like, why are your arguments just supposed to apply to those? Why aren't your arguments like general, like truth value arguments about the nature of people, right? Like if you win, the people are a priori reasoners, or like practical reasoners who use a priori reason. Why should that mean that you have just won it, like specifically the post-fiat distinction? Why can't you leverage that argument against written ballot issues?
All right, so we can,
Are there any other challenges?
Yeah.
There definitely are. So more, what are other arguments that K debaters often read against frameworks? There are a ton of them. Or even if you want to think about specific links to critique the frameworks might dive into. Yeah.
There's the idea that like basically any framework is sort of skewed by like the idea that we have to have abstraction in order to come to a framework. That like basically historically when people like when they're so like creating his social contract, he basically was like, well, you know, women don't necessarily like have like duties to participate in citizenry except in terms of like creating more male citizens.
Yeah. So we can actually unpack that a little bit. So one is definitely the idea of abstraction, right? One also might be the idea of just like philosophers being like racist or sexist or like ableist, homophobic, right? Etc. Right? And then also the idea that like, so abstraction is also sort of like, people say it's like the view from nowhere, right? It ignores like material conditions, as you were sort of saying.
okay.
So maybe we should talk about abstraction a little more, right? Does everyone know what that like idea means? Like, what is abstraction? Everyone else knows?
Raise your hand. Okay.
Okay. So the idea of abstraction, the K debaters like try to use when they say you're being abstract, they're basically saying that you are reading this like complicated, dense philosophical theory rather than spending time talking about the real world conditions of people who are being oppressed, essentially. Right.
And they're saying that distracts from the main issue, takes away time, but also is not an accurate way to look at the world because it ignores the particular standpoint of the oppressed and how they have been excluded from the way that these moral theories have been derived.
Yeah, like an example of that could be if someone says, you know, so if a Kant framework says people have to use practical reasons, right? Someone else might say, oh, that destroys, or people have to be treated as a means to an end, or things like that. There's some sort of universal subject that's like static, right? Someone might say, oh, well, that ignores the issue of people not being treated as like a universal, as like universally the same, right? Maybe people would say something like, Black people have never been counted in these moral calculations before. They are not treated as like practical reasoners or agents with value and worth. Like empirically, that's just like what has happened. So why should we care about your framework when clearly it hasn't persuaded anyone, right? Or it's not doing its job.
Okay. So let's talk about how to address this first issue, first barrier to being able to apply framework to the critique. So why might you be able to apply your framework arguments to the critique, even though the critique arguments are specific to debate? So what sort of claims do roll of the ballots generally make? Can somebody give me an example of a roll of the ballot?
Cool, yeah, so enable the roll of ballot.
Yeah.
What are like the parts, like what, like in order to be a good roll of ballot, what are like things that it should be saying?
So I thought
Yeah, definitely. But like, when you just have the role of the ballot itself, right? So the impact is often like describing the oppressive structure, but explaining why, like, we as debaters should be focused on combating ableism, for example.
So every roll of the ballot needs to have something normative. Does everybody know what the word normative means? Raise your hand if you don't. It's fine.
Well, just in case, normative means prescribing obligations. It's like telling you to do something. It means to say why we like have to do something, right? It was just that if you could just say something like, "Oh, ableism is really bad in the debate space," it should also say like, "We have a unique obligation to fix it and to solve it," right? Which might be obvious, right? It might seem like implied or like overly clear, right? And usually it might not be independently justified like with its own card, right? But definitely all of the ballots are making that claim, right? Like we have to do something. Otherwise there's no reason for the judge to vote on it.
So if all the ballots have some normative feature, then might we apply some general analytic framework arguments to the critique?
When we say analytic framework, we just mean like not a rolled ballot. We mean like a framework that like a run-of-the-mill framework that you might just like encounter.
Frameworks tell you how to act, and the organism tells you to act like in favor of the consequences. So, I mean, that's not really a framework.
Yeah. So it's framework arguments filter what can generate normative obligations in the first place. So if these roll of the ballots are trying to make normative claims, then your framework argument could sort of filter the way that they could do that.
What else? What else is like something that's a feature of rolls of ballot? I think raise your hand if you've read a roll of ballot. Okay, cool. So what's in them? Jagu.
Like,
You can jump in.
it's like really like epistemology claim, like how epistemology is like flawed. So like we need to resolve like material oppression to include voices. Yeah.
Like a particular argument, but
Yeah, that's generally like correct, I think. That's like an argument about how like I think it's like an epistemological claim, right? Often. I think you tried that before.
this is just a framework argument. This is like the same as like reading any normative framework argument.
Yeah.
And you can answer it the way you would answer any framework, using logical fallacies or comparing why your framework wants are better.
What are unique things about like rolls of ballot maybe? Not just that they're normative and they have epistemological claims, but there are other things that exist. Yeah.
I mean, you're going to have a conclusion argument, like you have to do this first before we can talk about the topic.
Yeah, sure. So the conclusion arguments, usually those conclusion arguments might stem from the epistemological claim, right? Like we need to do it first so we can like analyze our knowledge, or from the normative claim. But definitely, I definitely agree. There are definitely conclusion arguments. And you can explain why your framework has conclusion arguments too.
Okay. Most roll of the ballots talk about oppression. What is oppression?
You've all read roll of ballots before, so you should all be able to answer this question. Yeah.
Oppression would be like, I guess, like systematic discrimination against a group of people, like because of some facet of their identity that's like unchangeable, or something that they can't control.
That would certainly be an identity-based oppression.
Okay, well, is reverse racism oppression?
Well, no, but I'm trying to figure out how I would change the definition to exclude that.
So, oppression, we have the intuition, or a lot of people have the intuition that reverse racism is not oppression. It's hard to figure out why that's the case. Oppression is a general category, and the definition of it is certainly up for debate. And so, how might some normative framework help us in unpacking this idea?
And it's not up for debate that oppression exists. It's just up for debate how exactly we can define it so that we can best generate these normative obligations against it.
Yeah.
Like Kant would say, like, oppression is violations of the freedom of agents.
Yeah, so different frameworks contextualize what oppression is. And oppression as a concept, when it's not justified as like being some normative bad, often is a little bit vacuous. So that's another way that frameworks can generally go about attacking these critique arguments. They can concede most of the arguments about why oppression is the most important thing. Just try to explain what that means.
I think generally also just roll the balance would have an educational, like pedagogical claim. Just so you, just like the vocab thing, pedagogy is like the study of instruction and teaching. So a pedagogical claim would be a claim that talks about what is necessary in educational spaces, or what's the best form of education to be having. So sort of like Kristen was saying, like the starting point type argument, right? It might be like pedagogical, like it might be key for this to be our pedagogical starting point. In educational spaces, maybe it's the most important thing to talk about, like the preclusion arguments.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say like you make that preclusion argument, like let's say you make like the normative preclusion argument, like how like your framework is key to like generating the obligations in the first place, and then like is that just like a link chain of like your framework and then like their framework, and then you access your offense into your framework first, so you get access to your offense for theirs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
Okay.
Right.
Can we just go through the ideal theory better?
Yeah.
I think
So.
we should define ideal theory.
Yeah. Well, does anybody know what ideal theory is? Okay. So, ideal theory is like a category of framework or philosophy that generates obligations, sort of in what those obligations would be in an ideal world, as if everybody complied with X framework, then like we would all be being moral. Non-ideal theory is sort of contextualizing obligations within the material, like taking into account like material conditions / how taking into account the fact that some people will not be acting correctly, how we should act given those empirical constraints. A lot of abstraction bad arguments argue that either non-ideal theory or what some people call standpoint epistemology is better than ideal theory. So standpoint epistemology, can anybody take a guess for what that is? Amira?
Whenever you like view the world from like a person, like a person's like identity and the way that he looks out instead of just like general society.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's taking into account the particular standpoint of each person when making moral claims. ideal theory would focus on more of a universal subject way of understanding moral obligation, something that applies universally, not based on a particular standpoint of a person.
Yeah, people use the words abstraction and ideal theory sort of interchangeably. They're not synonyms. So ideal theory is this idea where you think of like the idealized subject, right? It's basically like a unit, like a marker, right? Like if you're like prescribing obligations, it's like every single thing that you prescribe obligations to is like a hypothetical. If you're like prescribing obligations in a world of markers, right? It's like you have a world of like this exact marker, office max, black dry erase marker, right? That is what you prescribe obligations to. And there are like billions of these. And you move them around and you figure out a system for these markers to operate best. Rather than thinking about maybe like the different like emotions of the marker, right? Or like the special features that would make some markers be more powerful than others, right? An ideal theory would just decide how the world works in a world of a billion of these, right? So, I'm not saying that it's always just like abstract, it's just erasing the specific features, right? It could be explaining what unites all markers, right? Everything could just be generated from obligations that are true with all markers. That could be fine. We'll talk about that in a second. But basically, ideal theory is like when you have a theory where it's just all black markers. And then when people say abstraction, they mean this is abstraction. So this is like a subset. This abstracts away from red markers or pink markers or markers that are like really dry when you write or something like that, right? Does that make sense? So abstraction is like, people are like, ideal theory is bad because abstraction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So going for ideal theory good, you should start by saying the three main categories of things that ideal theory good can get you in debate rounds. So if you win that ideal theory is good and you're reading a framework app against critique, what might be one of the implications?
And you guys all understand why you'd go for ideal theory good, right? Against a K if you're reading framework app. That makes sense, right? Yeah. And also it's good to phrase it as ideal theory good and not abstraction good, because abstraction is sort of like the characterization that they've assigned to ideal theory, and you want to explain why it might not be abstraction, right?
Yeah. So anybody have any guesses?
Can you rephrase the question, maybe?
Why might you go for ideal theory good? What strategic value does that have in a critique versus framework debate? Yes.
It's your offense is more relevant than the particular critique.
Yeah. So it allows you to say that your framework contextualizes impacts underneath their role of power. Okay, what's another thing? This one's relatively straightforward. What sort of critique does it answer? Like just straightforwardly. We've been talking about this critique.
Yeah.
Just like generally like any identity thing, probably answers pretty well.
Yeah, I think it would actually answer a lot of identity case, because it would answer, I'll put this up, the idea that we should be focusing on the standpoint.
Yeah, non-ideal theory and standpoint epistemology are like interchangeable, right? Sort of. Okay, why not? I think in the debate context they are.
Well, standpoint epistemology is more extreme. Non-ideal theory can like say that there are some obligations that we can generate absent the particular standpoint, but just looking at the material conditions versus like from the standpoint of epistemology is that like every single person's standpoint determines the obligation. Okay, this just straightforwardly answers the K of abstraction.
Yes. And oftentimes, people are not going to be like full-blown anti-ethics case, right, or a case of abstraction, although they often might. The thing that's useful about this is a K of abstraction it often takes the form of just floating weighing arguments for why their rules of outcomes first. So people will read, for example, you mentioned the ableism critique. People might read an ableism critique and then have 3 cards at the end about why abstraction is bad, right? So those are used as framework weighing arguments and framework justifications, or roles of ballot weighing arguments justifications. And the main reason that makes it like unique, I guess, is like, I think recently in debate at least, a lot of times roles of ballots are solely justified through abstraction bad arguments. Maybe one specific argument to the critique, but they spend a lot of time justifying this.
Okay. So, last thing is that it can be an explanation of why your methodology is a good methodology. And this becomes particularly relevant when the critique is mostly concerned with voting for the correct methodology for fighting oppression, because your framework could not only become an impact filter then, but can become proactive offense for you. So if they read a critique saying that the role of the ballot should not be concerned with just voting for the best advocacy, but rather the best methodology for fighting oppression, who has won that their method is good, then if you win that your methodology is the way to fight oppression best, like using ideal theory or whatever your framework is, then that becomes offense for you. Let's talk about specific arguments.
Yeah. Hold on, does everyone know what a method is? Yeah, awesome. Okay, just making sure.
Okay. So,
Do you want to write? Or should
I can write. So, the first argument for why ideal theory is good is written by a woman called Shayla Benavides.
Now we're literally just doing a laundry list of ideal theory good arguments. There are a ton of them. And these are all arguments that we will, probably at the end, we'll give you some articles. So you can cut them yourself.
Yeah. Also feel free to raise your hand if you don't understand as we're going through these.
Yeah, or just interrupt. It's a small group.
Yeah.
You can call out, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. So you wanna?
Yeah. So the Benavides argument basically says that ethical theories are necessary in order to mediate our relationships between each other, right? So the idea here is in, for example, a world where we are all committed to combating ableism, for example, people still must interact with each other. And people must still, like, work together to figure out strategies that are best for combating, like, ableism, right? That makes sense. People must work together. And the argument here is that we need to have a complete picture of ethical life and a complete picture of how people have to interact with each other, these guides to action, in order to have like a coherent strategy for liberation. Does that make sense? Like you need to be able to have, like for example, a conversation where they create a strategy, like if you decide who's in charge of the movement, for example, right? How would you decide? Is it the person who like has a gun, right? And you're like, I am now the person who fights against the oppressor because I have a gun and everyone else has to do what I say and decide what the best strategy is, right? That's probably bad. But there's no way to really determine if that's bad. If that person is really committed to fighting ableism, right? And they have a gun, and there are all these other people who also want to fight ableism, but they think another strategy is good, but they have to follow the strategy the person with the gun says is good. That is probably bad. I think that most of us would agree that we should have some sort of strategy that we like work together on or decide on together. But there's no way to actually mediate that relationship or decide, absent some ethical theory that tells us how to treat each other.
Yeah, so Benavides also talks about the concept of the concrete versus the universal other. The concrete other is like, actually like Zoe is a concrete other. But a universal other is like our idea just abstracting just any other person who we would think about how we should act. And the argument is that we need a universal other to mediate our relationship with the concrete other. Otherwise, we don't have like any reason or way to determine how we should treat the concrete other if we don't have some idea of what the universal other is.
Yeah, like for example, I should know how to treat like a person generally, right? To know how to treat Jillian, right? And it would also be different from like how I would treat maybe a dog, right? I can't make Jillian my pet. So we have specific obligations. So the universal other is not like a blob, right? It's like a person. We just don't know which person it is at the moment.
Yeah, and this can help leverage against critiques of like abstraction or non-ideal theory, because it says that you can still tailor your obligations to the concrete other, but you need some idea of what this universal other would look like to do that. The second argument is, as somebody calls it, gosh.
You know what Gosh's first name is?
I forgot.
I'll give you guys the article.
The idea here is that our relationships to other people exist within what we call an ethical community. And the ethical community recognizes historical injustices that prevent people from participating, but has this sort of end idea of what we want, of this full inclusion, and that ethics should strive to create this idealized form of an ethical community. This also answers critiques of abstraction by saying that we are not abstract. We recognize the fact that there are these historical injustices that have excluded people, but the way to move forward is to find strategies to include people within the ethical community.
Yeah, for example, like if someone is excluded from a community for any reason, right, our ethical theory would say that it's bad, right, that they should be, that we need to have some end goal of a community where people, where like ultimate goal of inclusion. However, like it is not like ahistorical to say that we should have a community with an ultimate goal of inclusion. The argument there is just like right now, like they would agree that something like racism is bad because it is excluding people from this ethical community. So it is recognizing that it's bad and saying we have to fix it by having this end goal in mind. So it's still providing a strategy and a picture of ethical life.
The next argument is that we need a way to bind the oppressor. So the argument here is that reason and ability to derive ethical frameworks through starting off with universal premises as opposed to just responses to particular situations is necessary to place normative claims on the oppressor, because every argument for why the oppressor has this unique standpoint and is not likely to listen to what we say is a reason why, if we allow ethics to just be based on each particular situation, the oppressor will just find ways to not act correctly. They will find ways to sort of sneak out of these obligations. These obligations are no longer binding because we're now giving them a pass to just contextualize it to each situation, so they can create exceptions for themselves. Universal ethical rules are needed to create a way to bind the oppressor. Starts from a universal premise that everybody would agree to, which means that we can actually hold them to these obligations.
Yeah, like, and remember, like, role of balance still have to be normative and still have to generate obligations, right? So it's not like you have to win first, that the oppressive, you need to have like obligations and bindingness, right? You should refer back to the fact that the role of battle relies on a conception of bindingness, right? But that's not something that you have to win proactively.
Yeah, this also can make your framework less abstract than theirs, because their framework just assumes that the oppressor will just act being consistent with X role of the ballot. You're the only one justifying how to actually create that binding obligation on.
Like how to force the oppressor to
Yeah.
be ethical.
Okay, this one I think is pretty straightforward.
And this is probably the most common one, right?
Yeah. You need something to strive for, / how to measure progress. Does anybody have a guess for what, like, does anybody try to explain?
Yeah, like make this argument.
Jeffrey?
Like, if you don't have an ultimate goal that you're trying to aim towards, and you're just gonna like, you keep working on like specific instances, and you never actually get to a point where you have like an ideal or perfect world where you've actually solved those instances.
Yeah, so I think the example for how to measure progress is sort of like, you can't, if you have like a ruler that's constantly changing sizes, then you can't measure anything, you can't see how far we've come, we have no idea whether we've made any progress at all, unless we have sort of like a constant ruler.
Yeah, so, and like a reason why ethical theories are a constant ruler is because like, you can concretely look at like, okay, in this moment in time, people were not being respected as themselves, or this group of people were not, and now they are, so that is good.
Yeah.
Right? Things like that, where you can just say, these sort of violations of frameworks can be easily analyzed, whereas it's really hard to otherwise say how progress is occurring.
Yeah.
Especially against pessimistic divisions where they don't say progress is possible, it's difficult to know how the alt is solved then.
Yeah, so need something to strive for. Also, a lot of roles of ballots justify something that is bad, but don't actually justify what like the normative good is, which your framework can exploit by saying that they don't have an idea of what we should be striving for, they just have something that we should not have. And examples for that can concretely make this a little bit more effective is, for example, you know the concept of gravity, and you know that it exists, but now I want you to go land something on the moon, land an Apollo on the moon. If you don't actually unpack the idea of what gravity is or justify how it works in the world, then you can't concretely apply it to situations. So even if you know oppression exists and that it's bad, if you don't actually know what it is or like why it's bad, then you can't try to fix it. Somebody called Chesterton writes an example of like, if I know that like blue, if I know that like purple is like a good color, I might just go around like painting everything purple, but that might not be like the most effective strategy to like knowing what like being good and consistent with purple. Also, the reverse racism example is a good example of this. If we can't justify why reverse racism isn't, for example, X form of oppression, then there's no way to know how to act.
Yeah, and like you can think about why other frameworks would solve, right? So for example, if you think about like having an ethical community, reverse racism might not be bad under like the gauche conception, or gauche, however you say it. Might not be bad under that conception, because then you're just like, it is not actively keeping people out of the ethical community, right? Those people are already in the ethical community, and it is just a step to bring people back, bring other excluded people back into the ethical community.
Yep.
So it creates an instruction manual that we can actually use.
Yeah.
Should I join do Lawrence?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so next up is like this guy named Lawrence, and he makes a couple of arguments. So the first one is that non-ideal theory assumes empiricism. So this argument is like one of the more like, I guess, right, not right is incorrect, right as in like left versus right arguments against non-ideal theory. The rest attempt to sort of like agree with most of the non-ideal theory claims, but explain how ideal theory is key to solving, right? But this is just saying non-ideal theory assumes empiricism, so it looks at like actual facts about the world and makes judgments based on them, right? Empirical judgments. So it could say, my framework proves that empiricism is false, which means you can't look at non-ideal theory.
Does anybody know what empiricism is?
They would not know what it is. Yeah. So who can explain it? Jeffrey, do you want to explain it?
It's just like basing our knowledge based on things that happened in the past.
Exactly. So utilitarianism is like, says we have to like look at empirical knowledge, right? We have to look at the situation and like make judgments, right? So non-ideal theory is also assuming empiricism because it's saying that we are basing our judgments off of concrete facts about the world. And people might make arguments like the fallacy of induction, which is basically like just because a rooster like crows each day, right? Like every day when you wake up, doesn't mean you can like know, or the sun rises each day, doesn't mean you can know that it'll rise the next day. Right?
Yeah.
You can't know anything.
The argument for why that is a problem is because it's circular. The only basis that I have for believing that the rooster will crow every day is because that is what has happened in the past. That presupposes the validity of induction, which is logically circular because it presupposes the conclusion.
Yeah, so that's the first argument that Lawrence makes. The non-ideal theory assumes empiricism. And you guys understand why this is a more like right argument in terms of left, like right versus left, because it's like taking a hard line against non-ideal theory, explaining why it's just like can't be a good way of looking at the world. You just can't look at individual perspectives because they're the empirical world. I prove empiricism false. But then there are other arguments that are a little bit more nuanced. For example, criticisms of ideal theory of ideal theory are themselves too abstract. So the argument there is like there is no one kind of ideal theory. Like for example, if someone reads an ideal theory bad against like just against a framework just because there's a lot of like big words in it, for example, like against like a Butler framework, it wouldn't make sense. So that's not ideal theory. Or if someone reads or like a critique of virtue ethics versus Kant would be very different because one is like a deontic conception of like obligations, and one is not talking about how we avoid moral skepticism and is instead talking about how to just like be a good person generally in virtue ethics, right? So they're like entirely different philosophical conceptions and worldviews that are as different as ideal theory and non-ideal theory are. Does that make sense?
The next argument is sort of an argument about like intersectionality. And the argument here is that if we base our ethical obligations off of each particular standpoint or group, for example, we say that because somebody who is black is subject to different material conditions, we hold them to different standards for ethical obligations, or we have to treat them differently. This leads to a problem of intersectionality because people are inevitably going to be part of tons of different standpoints, which means that either we create our obligations to sort of infinitely specific people, in which case we just cannot have normative obligation at all. We cannot create a universal obligation because it would have to be specific to each person's situation, or we inevitably exclude people from certain identity categories or aren't specific enough, and we create arbitrary bases to create ethical obligations. Like we stop at a certain point and say, this is like, okay, we're only doing it based on race. We're not going to include gender in the picture. So that leads to a problem of intersectionality. Only understanding obligations as sort of basing from this shared feature of humanity that everybody has can avoid this problem. I think this is a particularly persuasive.
I think this is a very persuasive argument because you're saying like, listen, I totally like think that you have a good point here about standpoint epistemology. Like, sure, like, we should be on standpoints. The issue is, then your framework just collapses in on itself. Because it would not make sense to say, like, okay, so, like, we just, like, stop, like, it's like if this is the, got the marker. It's like if this is, like, universal, right? And this is, like, the individual person. It wouldn't make sense to be, like, if this is, like, the spectrum of how the obligation should apply. In an ideal theory, we might take a stance, like, here, right? With, like, groups of people. Right? Like, why is that size group where we should stop abstracting, right? Or where we should just, like, be okay with that level of abstraction. Like, the level of abstraction to one group, like, to race or to gender.
Okay, so the next argument is that any theory can be misused. There are arguments about, like, why, like, Kant, for example, if they say, like, Kant was a racist. This argument is basically just that Kantian philosophy, like, might have been misused by Kant himself to justify racism. But that doesn't justify why the theory is itself bad, which means that their arguments sort of don't, like, justify why your framework is bad. They just justify why the use of it was bad. It doesn't justify why we shouldn't try to be consistent with it. And then the argument along the same lines is that the right has a monopoly on the word ethical, on morality. For example, like in politics, people are always like, well, you know, the right is like the most moral. They're like, they care about religion and they care about like stopping like abortion and stuff like that. And for some reason in politics, the right seems to have this claim to being the more moral party. So we sort of need to be able to reclaim that and justify why that requires, why our ethical theory is the most ethical. Why, like, the left is being more ethical. I think we should skip the next one so that we can.
Yeah, I think this one is a little, like, I think the misused argument is like more of a defensive argument, I think.
Yeah, but with the reclaiming.
Yeah, the reclaiming is good.
So this one, I think, so advocating critiques of abstraction argue like like abstraction is inaccessible to Black people, or like ethical theories are too abstract and exclude minorities. This argument seems a little bit essentialist. Does anybody know what the word essentialist means? Okay, so the idea is that to say that like philosophy is just universally not accessible to Black people is to like make a claim that seems a little bit too extreme and
And racist.
Racist, yeah.
Like, the idea that, like, for example, if someone reads a critique, it makes arguments against, like, a Kant framework, right? And says this is the whitest philosophy I've ever seen, right? This philosophy is totally inaccessible to Black people. Like, what does that say to, for example, Black students who are interested in learning about Kant or taking philosophy classes, or, like, Black Kantian scholars, right?
Yeah, so I think
those people definitely exist.
Like,
so,
for example, Farr, somebody named Farr. There's a really good interview between Yancey, he criticizes abstraction, and Adrian Piper is a Black Kantian who writes about how Kantianism and his identity intersect. So I think that giving those concrete examples can explain. that better.
Yeah, and then the Bruckner argument is similar. It's just like, that's another author name. Basically they say that like, arguing that you need to accommodate or change philosophy to like accommodate minorities is always going to replicate racist logic, right? So saying we need to have some sort of like, I guess the argument would be saying we need to have some sort of like special or different philosophy is a problem. Because it's saying that like, this kind of philosophy is not, like, when the philosophy applies to a universal subject, it basically just like re-excludes minorities.
Yeah. So, well, one argument you can make is that standpoint epistemology devolves to relativism. It says that if we have to focus on every single standpoint and why that standpoint generates obligations, then every obligation is just relative. There are no universal obligations, which is obviously bad from a critical standpoint, because then there's no way to be like, X type of oppression is bad and we should stop it.
This is similar to the thing with like the intersectionality problem.
Yeah,
right?
and actually Charles Mills writes about this, and this is useful because a lot of people use him to justify why non-ideal theory is better.
He's probably the most common non-ideal theory author.
Yes, but he strongly believes that some degree of abstraction/ideal theory is necessary. So I think that's really useful to have cards from him. And he writes he actually makes a lot of these different arguments. He makes like this argument too. So I think it's useful to have carded evidence from him just because it sounds more persuasive.
Yeah, you say like your own author knows that we need to have some degree of ideal theory in order to have bindingness, right? Something like that.
This argument is sort of similar to the one about convincing you need a way to bind the oppressor, but just there's an example. There's a pseudo-Kantian called Fichte, if you've ever heard of him. He's a German philosopher, and he was basically very anti-Semitic, and then he became a Kantian scholar. And then during like Nazi Germany, he like became staunchly anti-Nazi because he believed in Kantian philosophy and realized that anti-Semitism was bad. So this is an example of how like reason can convince people to be better. The last argument I'll talk about is just that rational reflection allows us to transcend bias. So racism and discrimination comes from just willingness to follow emotional instincts. For example, the instinct to dislike someone who's different from us or be afraid of somebody who's different from us is like something that creates bias and racism. But if we recognize that those things are arbitrary and should not be the basis of how we act, and we should act on reason, then we can help to transcend those biases and act better. Cool. Does this argument make sense? All right.
You stop here?
Yeah, I think we can stop. We didn't get to the specific framework interactions, but we can go over those either tomorrow or the next day.
Yeah.
I think these generally are good explanations, like general arguments for you understand the implications of these arguments, right? How they can be used to impact filter, explanations of why your framework contextualizes better what oppression is / how to solve it. So the offense that you would have is more relevant, or just a defense of your methodology.
And we've used Kant as like our go-to example. This is not just for Kant, right? This is a budgeting framework that you can use anything that has like a universalized subject.
If you win your argument for why ideal theory is necessary, then your like method of deriving obligations is the one that you use. So the conclusion of your framework is then the way that you should filter impacts. Does that make sense?